How's it going, everybody? My name is Lee Woodmancy, and I am the discipleship pastor here at Immanuel Baptist Church. I'm going to take the next 20 minutes or so to actually walk through all of John chapter 9 in our study of the Gospel of John. We've had to make necessary cuts as to what content we're going to cover on Wednesday nights and what material we're not. And this is one of those sections that we're just doing a filler episode here on YouTube to actually bridge the gap between John chapter 8 and what we're going to be covering in John chapter 10. And so, to that end, I want to make sure that we just dive straight into it and be able to cover this in a fairly succinct way. And so, first thing I want to do is I want to give us a little bit of a recap from last session. When the last time that we were teaching, we were talking about John chapter 8, and this is one of those really huge chapters in the Gospel of John, because this is where we really see the crowds that Jesus is speaking to are really starting to turn into a mob, and we're starting to see Jesus confronting their sin, making really bold declarations, and it's a really big deal. And so, here's what we need to know from all of John chapter 8 that we covered from the last session. Number one, we are incapable of overcoming darkness under our own abilities. You saw in John chapter 8, starting there in verse 12, where Jesus declares that he is, in fact, the light of the world, and that he is the one that is shining into the world, demonstrating his goodness. And these are really big ideas for our author John. When he talks about light and dark, he's normally talking about spiritual settings, spiritual situations in people's lives. And so when Jesus declares that he's the light of the world here towards the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, this is a big deal, and we are incapable of overcoming darkness on our own. Whenever we see Jesus making these proclamations, he is actually extending an invitation to life. And if we choose that, then we have life. However, if we refuse the offer that Jesus is giving, we necessarily are choosing death. The third thing that I wanted to talk about was that we see that there is this sense that we must remain with Jesus. We must abide and have his word abide in us and us in him, and that abiding is actually a demonstration of our genuine faith. And we saw that towards the end of the session. And then lastly, the thing that I really want us to see is that whenever Jesus speaks, he speaks authoritatively, and that his word is binding on our lives. If we truly are his disciples, we should do what he says. And if we aren't his disciples, his word is still just as binding. And we're going to see some of that even here in this video. So, where are we heading this session? Well, ultimately, we're going to be covering all of John chapter 9. And so this is what we are going to be doing. We are going to hit this encounter with Jesus healing a blind man. He's going to make some mud, rub it in his eyes, and the guy's going to go wash, and he's going to be able to see. But what's going to happen after Jesus encounters this guy is we're going to see a series of interrogations. There's this conversation that the neighbors have with this man, and then we're going to see the Pharisees have a conversation with this man, and then we're going to see the Pharisees have this interrogation of the man's parents, and then they're going to bring him back in. So that's 4 whole interrogations that are going on about this dude and this healing that Jesus performed on him. And so we're going to cover that in our first 3 sections, and then the last one we're going to see Jesus come back to the story, because he disappears at the end of verse 7, really, and then he doesn't show up until verse 35. And so we're going to talk about how Jesus is going to have this interaction with not the blind man, but the one who is now seeing. And then after that, we're going to give some final thoughts. There it is. That's our roadmap. Let's dive into it. So I want to read for us from John chapter 9, starting in verse 1. This is something that's really critical for us to see right out the gate. This is what John records for us. As he passed, speaking of Jesus, he saw a blind man who was blind from birth, and the disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And so here's the first thing we need to see, is that the disciples here are actually asking an honest question. The Jews, and in their tradition of what blindness actually meant, is this was like a real spiritual condition. And we're going to see John is going to pick up on that, our author, but what the Jews really thought about that was that there was a sin, a specific sin that was linked to someone like this man who was blind from birth. And it was either because this child had sinned in utero while they were gestating in their mother's womb, or that this man was born blind because of the parent's sin. And so the disciples asked that question, well, who sinned? And what we see happening is that Jesus actually sidesteps the whole question, and instead of talking about the causes of this sin, what Jesus is going to focus on is the result. He says, guys, neither. You're missing it. It's not about whose sin caused this. He says this in verse 3. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. And so Jesus is going to demonstrate, hey, those are questions that we can have a conversation about at some other time. But right now, what you need to see is that what's really about to happen is I'm about to display my power and my might in this dude's life right in front of all of y'all. And so what happens from there is that Jesus picks up on this other highly symbolic motif that's running through the Gospel of John. He talks about there in verse 4, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, because night is coming. And what we need to pick up on is that day and night are incredibly powerful symbols of light and darkness in John. And when we couple that together with this specific healing in John chapter 9, with this man being blind from birth, you start to see the symbolism gets ramped up. And so John is recording Jesus saying this incredibly poignant statement here at some point following the Feast of Tabernacles, when he had declared that he is the light of the world. And now he is saying this is what happens whenever the light of the world shows up. John chapter 9 is the outworking of Jesus being the light of the world, because what does he do with this blind man? He heals him. He makes him well. He can now see. And the whole crux of the matter, though, with this healing is that he does it on the Sabbath. And according to how the Pharisees viewed this, he had broken the Sabbath because he was healing on the Sabbath, because he was making the mud, the clay, with the spit, and he was rubbing it on his eyes, so he was anointing this man. And so in the Pharisees' eyes, Jesus had actually broken the Sabbath not once, but 3 different times in one singular act. But here's the deal. The way that John talks about this with this lightness or light and darkness, day and night motif, there's a whole lot more going on here than what immediately meets the eye, as it were. So that's the first thing that we need to see, is that Jesus declaring he's the light of the world in John chapter 8, verse 12. And now we're starting to see that getting worked out in John chapter 9 as he is beginning to heal this man of blindness. So let's now turn to this first and second interrogations that we see taking place. Let's pick it up there in verse 8. The neighbors and those who had seen him before he was a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And then some said, yeah, and others said, well, not so much. But here's the point. The neighbors are flabbergasted. Like, they don't know what to make of this. Some of them are even disputing, is this even the guy? And the thing that's crazy about this is that they are disputing whether or not this is actually the guy, even though what he says there in verse 9 is like, no, I'm the guy. Like, I am that man who used to sit and beg and who was blind. They just don't have a category for how this works out. Nobody just walks up and heals some dude who's been blind from birth. That just doesn't happen every day. And so they don't know what to do with it. And so what does this man do? He describes his healing. You can see there in verse 9 and 10, it says, hey, how is it that my eyes were opened? He answered, the man called Jesus, this guy, I've never seen him because I was blind. This man named Jesus, he made mud. He anointed my eyes. And he said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And so I washed and I received my sight. And so he describes this healing that takes place. Note here that there is something that's really critical for that. There's no way for this guy to know where Jesus went to after this, because we don't see Jesus in the narrative until verse 35 later on. And this makes sense, because if you look at the way that this guy was instructed to be healed, is that Jesus makes the mud, he anoints him, and then he tells him to go to the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. And he goes and is healed, but Jesus isn't there with him. He couldn't describe Jesus, what he looked like. He couldn't describe where he went. He was blind until he wasn't, and then when he wasn't blind, Jesus was gone. So the neighbors are just absolutely flabbergasted. They don't really know what to do, and he just like, I don't know where he is. Like, I don't know what you want me to do. So then let's pick it up there in verse 13. And so they brought him to the Pharisees, or brought to the Pharisees the man who had been formerly blind. And you notice there the switch is now, he wasn't blind, but now he's formerly blind, because there's no mistaking this dude is now healed. And so now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus had made the mud and opened his eyes. And so the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And so whereas we saw that the neighbors were flabbergasted, we're going to see that the Pharisees are offended. It was the Sabbath. How dare Jesus make mud? How dare Jesus anoint this man? How dare Jesus heal this man on the Sabbath? And so they demand an answer from this guy. And well, the best answer this dude has is like a really short, terse response where he once again describes his healing. He called me over, he made the mud, he anointed, he called me to wash, I see. What else do you want me to say? I've already told this story once to the neighbors, and now I'm telling it to you again. But what happens from there is that the Pharisees are divided. Let's pick it up there in verse 16. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God. Speaking of Jesus, there's no way this dude's from God, for he doesn't keep the Sabbath. He broke it 3 different ways on one day. And so the conversation spins forward from there. He says he doesn't keep the Sabbath, but others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such things? Like, this doesn't make sense, because if he really was that bad of a sinner, like, how could he heal this guy? Like, there's no way this dude was once blind and is now not, and that happened by some wretched dude, right? And so how is it that this guy can do that? And so there was a division among them. So again, they said to the blind man, what do you say about this guy who opened your eyes? All right, man. Okay, we're still figuring out what we actually think about this. What about you? What do you think? And what the healed man says is he professes that Jesus, he's got to be a prophet. You guys are over here arguing as to whether or not he's a sinner or not. All I know is that I was blind and now I see. He's got to be a prophet. Like, his only category for someone who can do those types of things is someone who is with God and speaks for God like a prophet. Yeah. So that's the first and the second interrogations. But now we need to look at this third and fourth interrogations. So after the Pharisees get done with him, they call this dude's parents in. And it seems as though they are calling this adult man's parents into the room because they're trying to discredit the miracle, because he said something that they really did not like. And we're going to get a glimpse into that here in just a moment. So let's look at it there in verse 18. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. They asked him, is this your son? And they said, yeah. They asked him, was he blind? Yeah. Is he now able to see? Yeah. Ask him for yourself. He's right here. And so this exchange goes on back and forth. But what happens there is that the parents are now interrogated. And not only are the parents interrogated, they knew something crazy had happened. They knew that he was blind, but now he was healed. And even if they knew Jesus or didn't, what they are getting right now is that the stakes are now raised. Let's pick it up there in verse 21. But now he who now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. Verse 22, and John gives us this little tidbit of information, and he says this there in verse 22. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. And what that means is that they would be removed from this life-giving place there in their religious life, and that they wouldn't risk that. And so what do? They're intimidated, and they say, look, just ask him. He's of age. So we can see here that in John chapter 9, where we have this huge conflict that had blown up in John chapter 8 with Jesus talking about I'm the light of the world, and then before Abraham was, I am. All of that is now starting to spread, not just to Jesus, but anyone who says, yeah, Jesus is the Christ. And so the parents here, they're intimidated, and so they back off. So what do we do there? Let's pick it up there in verse 24. The parents said, hey, he's of age, go ask him. And so the Pharisees dragged this cat back in front of them one more time. This is now the fourth interrogation. Pick it up in verse 24. Now, so for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. And what they're actually saying there is, hey, man, you need to tell the truth. Be honest here. Don't give glory to Jesus. Give glory to God. If anyone's healed you, it's him, right? Wink, wink, right? God, not Jesus. And they go on to say that give glory to God. We know that this man, speaking of Jesus, he is a sinner. There's no way that dude did the healing. It had to have been God. So just tell us the truth, man. Just tell us the truth. And so they charge him to be honest. But what ends up happening is this guy who's getting interrogated, he starts getting really frustrated by their questions. He gets real frustrated, because let's pick it up there in verse 26, or excuse me, verse 25. He answered, whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Verse 26, and they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I've already told you. I've already answered that question for you. I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why then do you want to hear it again? And this is where I think there is this beautiful interaction that takes place between this guy who was blind and now has been able to see because of what Jesus had done for him. He is now going to turn the tables on them. They've been interrogating him. And so now this guy is going to unload on them. And what he's going to do is he is actually going to expose the Pharisees' motives here. I want to read from the commentary from D.A. Carson. And this is what he says about this guy who had been healed. After this questioning, this is what he says. With a show of innocence, this man, he asks if their desire to hear a repetition of his testimony is bound up with a secret desire to become disciples of Jesus themselves. His ironic, taunting question strips off all pretense of trying to trip him up and all pretense of an even-handed evaluation. And so what this guy does, he says, okay, guys, like I've already given you an answer and you didn't want to hear. This is what he says. Let's pick it up there in the end of verse 27. Do you also want to become his disciples? Guys, I gave you the answer before and you didn't respond. Oh, you must want to be a disciple of Jesus too. Implying that he is now a follower of Jesus, implying that he has trusted Jesus, implying that he recognizes that there's something special about Jesus. And so they get furious. They say, look, we are disciples of Moses, not Jesus. Don't you dare mention that name in front of us, is what goes on. But this guy just keeps pressing them, and he is super bold. Verse 30. Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, speaking of Jesus, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, which there's Old Testament scripture that could back that up. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God will listen to him. Right, Pharisees, you know the Old Testament. And isn't it crazy that I was blind and this guy healed me? Well, that must mean he's not a sinner. And he turns the tables right back on them, and he is exposing their motives. Verse 32, never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. And if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. What you got to say about that, Pharisees? Verse 34, they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you now teach us? And they cast him out. They put him out of the synagogue. Here's what I need us to see, is that whenever these guys are backed into a corner, using solid logic from this blind beggar, this guy who'd been blind from birth, he basically says, look, guys, we all agree that there's no way someone who's a sinner could heal me, and yet he healed me, therefore he must not be a sinner. So maybe he's right and you're wrong. And so, infuriated, they kick him out of the synagogue. The fear that the parents had actually take place and happen to this younger guy, or this guy who'd been born blind from birth, right? And so that's the end of the fourth interrogation, but it's not the end of the story, because what's going to happen in verse 35 is Jesus is going to show back up, and he's going to have an encounter with this man who is now able to see. Let's pick it up there in verse 35. This is what John records. Jesus heard that they had cast him out of the synagogue, that they had removed him. Cast him out, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And so what Jesus does is he goes and finds this guy, and he inquires about his faith. Hey, man, I've been hearing some things about, they said that I was a sinner, but you don't think I'm a sinner. So let me just ask you a simple question. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you have faith in that guy? And what this guy responds with, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And that implies like, yep, just point me in the right direction. Just show me who this dude is, and I am ready to put my faith in him. And what we see is that there is a beautiful poetic response from Jesus. Pick it up there in verse 37. Jesus said to him, you have seen him. You know, looking at him, guy. Rewind a couple hours ago, and that wouldn't have been able to be said because you were blind. But the Son of Man, the one who has healed you, that's me. This beautiful poetic response of, you have seen him. It's me. You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And what the man says is, I believe. He says, Lord, I believe, and he worships Jesus. We see that there is this clear distinction between this man who has been having this miraculous encounter with Jesus where he is healed and he has gone from being incapable of sight to now being able to see. And we can see light and darkness themes coming in there. And then that's going to hit us over the head with this very next section because the Pharisees are going to overhear this exchange. Let's pick it up there in verse 39. Jesus said to him, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, like you, and those who see may become blind, like them." Verse 40, and some of the Pharisees near him heard these things, and they said, "Are we also blind, Jesus?" And the answer is, yep. Verse 41, Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. You'd be just like my man right here, and you would put your trust in me. However, you say, we see. Your guilt remains." And so the Pharisees are feeling some condemnation from Jesus. They are absolutely feeling precisely what it is that Jesus was forcing upon them. I healed this man so that he might believe in me. You saw it take place. What are you going to do with this knowledge as well? Because he responded positively. He responded in a way that shows that he has faith. What about you? And they can't do it. And so what Jesus is doing, he's just confirming that they're condemned. You said it yourselves, guys. You can see. You're good. Stick with that. Or you can be like my man over here and trust me. But they're unwilling to do that. And so that's how the chapter ends. But let's run through some final thoughts, because I feel like there's some big stuff here that we do need to mention to put a bow on this. So number one, here's what I would say. This historic account, this is something that actually happened. John records here, sandwiched between John chapter 8 and John chapter 10 to kind of bridge this gap of the light of the world. This historic account is incredibly symbolic. This lightness, or light and darkness, day and night. It's not just talking about physical darkness where he can't see. It's also talking about spiritual darkness where this man went from someone who had no hope to now someone who is a believer and a follower of Jesus, and he has all the hope in the world. This is incredibly symbolic. That's number one. Number two, I would say this. Jesus gives life to the most desperate among us. This dude had been a beggar, had been blind since birth. What prospect did he have of moving upward in life? What prospect did he have? And the answer is none. And yet Jesus comes and he saves this man. He heals him and he shows him that he is in fact the light of the world by giving him light in his eyes so that he can see and perceive. And he is called out of the spiritual darkness and into his glorious light, is what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2. That's what takes place. Jesus gives life to the most desperate among us, and that includes you and me, because I have no hope outside of Jesus. I am incapable of overcoming darkness on my own. We all are. So all of us are incredibly desperate. Here's the third thing that I want us to see. The blind man actually shows a progression in his understanding of who Jesus is. And I think for a lot of us, this is actually how life and faith actually works out for most of us in most of the times. And so I want to read from this commentary from Bill Cook. He wrote a commentary, and this is what he says about this whole section. The progression of titles throughout the narrative reveals how the man's understanding slowly came to the light. Jesus is a man, verse 11. He's a prophet, verse 17. One who is to be followed, in verse 27. He is from God, verse 33. The Son of Man and Lord who is to be worshipped, in verse 37 through 38. As a person walks in the truth, their capacity for understanding truth is enlarged. And so what's going on there, and what Bill's comments there is that the more that you see and respond to Jesus and the revelation of himself, the more he shows us. Revelation and then response. He gives you a glimpse of who he is, and then you respond to it in faith. And that causes him to show you a little bit more. And that cycle just repeats. This progression is something that many of us experience, and frankly, all of us should be experiencing for the rest of our lives. Here's the last comment that I would have. As the light of the world, Jesus both brings sight and perception spiritually, but he also exposes wickedness and shows where judgment needs to fall. Jesus is divisive. He is. Whenever people see him at work in the world around other people, whether it's miracles or conversations he is having, he is divisive. And when he is the light of the world, that light is going to expose darkness, and it's going to bring sight for those of us, not only to see the world around us, but also to see the way out. And so this is where we end with John chapter 9. This has been like a big chunk for us to really take in at once. And there are all sorts of connections between John chapter 9 and 10, which we're going to cover later this week. And so make sure that you follow up with that and see those connections. But here's the point. Whenever we see Jesus acting in the Gospel of John, it is meant to call us to this response in faith for him. And I would just challenge you, if you need help in discerning what that next step of faith would be for you, have a conversation with me. You can drop a comment in the video. You can call us at the office. You can get a hold of me at with my email easily. But I want you to respond in faith to what it is that the Lord is showing you. And so with that, I just want to end like we normally do by telling you I look forward to the next time, and do good and don't sin.